You want to shut the kitchen door? So good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, both here on location and online. I welcome you all. Simon Jacobson is my name, and I'm here to talk about immortality and mortality. With a small little introduction, a short introduction, the mission, so to speak, of this coming together. I never liked calling this a class. I didn't like classes when I was in school, and I don't like classes today. The idea of classes and classifications are a little too constraining. So for people who are free spirits and are looking to transcend and find some form of liberation, the word class may be a little too limiting. What do you think, Rabbi? You agree? Huh? You're on live TV here, so. Well, there's one person that agrees. So, but the word in the Torah, you don't have the word class in the Torah, you have the word called Vayakel. Moses gathered the people. He gathered the people. Kehila, Kahal, Kol Gadol. So Vayakel is a statement that is in a later chapter in the Torah where Moses gathers the people. And from there we derive, the Talmud says that Moses instituted a custom that the people should gather every Shabbos and study, which is one of the reasons why you find in synagogues till this day the custom to come together, not just to pray, but also to study. Beit HaKnesset, Beit HaMedrash, a place that people gather together to study, because it has the power of the gathering. And the power of the gathering is like the power of synergy. In modern terminology, synergy. Synergy means a collective energy that's more than the sum of the parts. So in Judaism, the concept of synergy has actually a name, a Kabbalistic name, that comes from the Zohar. And the name is it's called Ir Ha'ela Al Kolana, which means the energy or the light that rises above them all. And the simple example given for it in Jewish mysticism is that, for example, when you take a word like Baruch, Baruch is a Hebrew word that means blessing. We say Baruch Atah, blessed, or there's the name Baruch. People have the name Baruch. Anyone with the name Baruch here? Okay. So the name Baruch consists of 4 letters in Hebrew. The root is Beis Reish Chaf, or Beis Reish Vav Chaf. And when you add up all the 4 letters, it's more than the sum of the parts. It's not just 4 letters. Now the 4 letters have a meaning which far outshines the actual letters. The word blessing is much more than the letters B-L-E-S-S-I-N-G. That's what synergy is. Or that's what the word Ha'er Ha'el Al Kolana means, a light and energy that is more than the sum of the parts. In simple terms, the Talmud, for example, makes calculations that prove, this is based on the scouts, the Meraglim, when they were carrying back the fruit from Israel from the Promised Land. They were going to show the Jews how large and how gargantuan the people and the fruits and the parts of Israel were, to scare them off, to frighten them. So the Talmud in the tractate Seta has all kinds of calculations, but it comes down to this, that if, for example, if I can lift up 100 pounds and you can lift up 100 pounds, together it would seem logical we could both lift up 200 pounds. But that's not the case. We both can lift more than 200 pounds. Even though I can't lift more than 100, and you can't lift more than 100. So there's some type of invisible, what we call synergy, that's more than the sum of the parts, that when 2 people come together, there's more than 100 than 100. There's some amount, and there's calculations there, it could maybe 205 or 210. And with each additional person that joins the group, it exponentially grows that many times more, to the point where you have 10 people, it's not just 10 times, it's many, many more times than that. Which teaches us that the power of a gathering, where people come together, and specifically not clones. If we were all puppets and all exactly the same, it wouldn't have the same power. But specifically because we're different types of people, and today online you don't know how many people could be listening or watching, thousands of people. that the fact that everyone is individual and they still come together for a certain common goal, that creates an unbelievable synergy, spiritually and of course even physically, as I said, and emotionally. Maybe this is one of the root powers, what they call the powers of this 12-step program. But in general, they see in healing and many other ways you have demonstrated. There's demonstration of a power of a group. Now, of course, a group could also be a negative thing, where people become lynch mobs, and you have a group mentality, herd mentality, as they call it, where one person just does something and everyone just follows, complete conformity. And you see groups that that group together for negative reasons can become a very powerful negative force. So, of course, group doesn't always mean that it's always going to be a positive force, but if it's used for a positive force and the individuals involved have a common good goal, the synergy of a group is tremendous and much more than any individual can bring to the table. So let's call it a gathering rather than a class. You second that? Yeah? Good. Yeah. So with that small introduction, so what is this gathering about? The mission of this gathering is to try to not waste our night here and waste our time, but to come away with something that is truly meaningful, that can help us deal with some of the struggles and challenges of our lives. And obviously it's good to have stimulating ideas and inspirational ones, but above all, I think empowerment is a key thing. When I say empowerment, we all have our challenges. Everybody's got their challenges, positive ones, and negative ones, personal ones, psychological ones, emotional. Many of our challenges are invisible. Some are very visible. The very visible ones are the ones we have at work, at home, sometimes with our spouses, families. The invisible ones, of course, are much more complicated because they're invisible even to ourselves. And they usually deal with the different psychological forces that are part of our childhood, the relationship we have with our parents, our fathers and our mothers. And the earlier on a childhood experience, we know, the more impact it has on a person. To use the analogy, like if we are all from birth like a warm ball of wax, so as different experiences happen in our lives, it becomes engraved in the wax. And as we get older, it gets hardened. As the wax hardens, these influences have very profound impact to the point that it's very hard to even control it. Like, for example, you find people who have uncontrollable rage or anger, and they can't control it, and even they themselves don't like it. But there's always going to be excuses that someone hurt them or someone has provoked them, and so on. But the fact is, other people are provoked and they don't get so angry. So clearly, it's not always an excuse to blame somebody else. But often these streaks of rage and anger come from a childhood where a person the child saw a lot of anger in their home. They saw it as a so-called viable and legitimate, quote-unquote, tool. So when you see a father or mother gets angry, when something happens, it becomes, as a child, it becomes engraved in your mind that that's a solution, even though it's an unhealthy one. But you think it's all right because your parents, who were like God when you were a child, did it. And those attitudes become engraved in your warm wax. So as you get hardened, the wax hardens. It's not so easy to go back and say, okay, let's just reshape my attitude. You have to warm the wax again, which requires sometimes very serious work, like surgery, not physical surgery, psychological surgery. So that's just one example. And of course, very traumatic experiences in childhood always leave a mark, always leave a scar. Now, this is not per se a bad thing. We all have our scars. Everybody grew up in homes. No home is perfect. No one's going to be immune to life experiences, but some are more severe than others. And of course, it's not just the question what experiences we've had, it's also what coping mechanisms we have. It's one thing when you have someone hurts you, and you have someone to run to help protect you and help you heal. But if you're told by the people around you nothing happened, or you're not allowed to cry, or nothing, or you're supposed to keep it a secret, then obviously that creates even more problems. But I'm not going to go through all the examples of the different challenges we all have. Everybody here, everybody that's watching this online has their particular story. And I personally, growing up in a traditional Jewish home and going to yeshiva and the whole intense Torah experience, for me it was always a challenge, even as a child, as a teenager particularly. The quick question I always asked myself was, we all grew up saying the prayer in the evening that the Torah is chayenu v'erech yameinu. The Torah is our life and our sustenance. It's our life and our sustenance. Now, you could, in esoteric and abstract terms, yeah, of course, we eat and drink. So officially, the Torah is supposed to be a spiritual type of nourishment. But I always struggled with the question: if it's so spiritually nourishing, why is it that so many people who are Torah observant and abiding Jews are psychologically screwed up? Why isn't the Torah nourishing their souls and their psyches? So the obvious answer you're always given is that it has an impact somewhere in the higher worlds, even though it hasn't yet manifested in this material world, which just makes the question more complicated. It's one thing if you say the Torah is just a book of laws, so give charity, keep Shabbos, eat kosher, be a kind person, all the different technical laws. But then it's not necessarily, then you wouldn't call it life and sustenance. Life and sustenance, if you go to read other books of philosophy or psychology or spirituality to find internal sustenance, then why would the Torah be called that? So that always troubled me, and I never found an answer, to be honest, as a teenager in my yeshiva system and the faculty, which only made the question worse for me, because I said to myself, maybe they don't have an answer. And maybe everybody's just the blind leading the blind. Not to take away from any of the beautiful things in Jewish tradition, but Judaism can become a very mechanical exercise. Like anything could be mechanical. I even remember when I said that type of, some would call very irreverent or sacrilegious question that I asked one of my teachers. I asked it actually intentionally to provoke. I said, so what's the difference maybe Catholics and Muslims who grew up in their homes being taught their dogmatic mechanical system, also think that is absolute truth that God gave them? How do you know that Jews, if we're just doing it blindly like that, what makes a devout Jew better than a devout Catholic? And had he been closer to me, I would have gotten a good slap. But the key thing was there was no answer. That was the only response, was anger. How could you even think like that? It's a heresy, etc., etc., etc. Which is fine. Maybe I'm a heretic, but that doesn't mean there's an answer. That's an answer to the question. It's like the guy that says, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean no one wants to get me. Just because I may be a heretic doesn't mean the question is a legitimate question. Anyway, I'm not going to go through my whole confession, which isn't a Jewish concept anyway, of my childhood, etc. But the reason I mention it is not because I want to be cute, but to me it was a real soul search and a real struggle. And thank God I came to an answer, not through my faculty. I went back to the books, and I had to search for it, and it was not easy. Because around you, when you look at it, you see most of Jewish establishment is very mechanical, very political even. I'm not going to get into say everything is corrupt, but political and bureaucratic and all that type of stuff always leads to some form of corruption, because human beings are human beings. So then where is this divine Torah come into play? If nobody is really living up to it, and it doesn't answer psychological, emotional struggles, if it can't help a person control their anger, and there's much and abuse and so on. So yes, there's much virtue. The Torah is based on a lot of virtuous principles, especially in the area of charity and kindness. And in any Jewish community, you'll find, even mechanical Jews, you'll find a lot of chesed, which is generosity. You have communities where there'll be a bikkur chen, will be an institute that deals with the sick, caring for the sick, caring for the aged, caring for those that are needy. Different charitable causes. It's all right. No water needed. It's perfectly fine. See, there's the generosity, the compassion in action. Is that mechanical or worked through? Yeah, thank you. So this doesn't take away from all that mechanical beauty, because it was better to have mechanical virtue and generosity than nothing at all, obviously, than to be cannibals. But it still leaves wanting a lot if it doesn't deal with the deeper issues. So in my exploration and struggle, and I finally looked and finally found, and I realized that in the books, yes, Abraham and Moshe Rabbeinu and these great leaders, you go back to if you want to look at something, you always want to go back to the point of departure. Before it got messed up, or before it's distorted. So you have to go back to the root. So if you try to create a profile of what kind of man was Avram Avinu, if he came today into 21st century Judaism, whether it's in the most religious communities in Borough Park, Williamsburg, Meir Sha'arim, Geula, wherever, would he be comfortable there? Would he go into synagogues today? Which shul would he choose? Or maybe he wouldn't choose any of them. You start asking such questions, it's a pretty interesting thing, because he didn't dress like Jews dress today. Yes, he was the first person who circumcised himself and his family, and he definitely established the basics of what would become formal Judaism and formal Torah at Mount Sinai. But what kind of human being would he be like? And even thinking like that is not something that's encouraged. Because first, many people are afraid to think like that because you try to humanize him. Avraham Avinu was such a holy man, you can't even humanize him. I'm not trying to humanize him, I'm just trying to understand what would he look like? Which Rebbe would he look like? There's a lot of Rebbes. If we could identify that would be a good criteria. And if the Torah doesn't tell us ways to figure out what kind of man he was, then who exactly determined what is the model of a human being according to the Torah? What is the model? Is it something that created in the Middle Ages, in the time of the Talmud? In which country? In Russia? In Hungary? In Germany? Jews everywhere. Sephardim, Ashkenazim. What is the model? And how was it meant to be? Now, obviously, we all know that in Judaism there's much diversity. Nara Pashta is an expression, different customs, different traditions, and they all can be within the context of Torah, true Judaism. Diversity has always been part of Judaism. When the Jews left Egypt, there were tribes. Each tribe had its path. Even when they crossed the sea, the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, there were 12 different paths, and different customs, and different personalities, and different approaches to things. Obviously, the basic principles, the foundations are the same. But diversity was always not just encouraged, it's part of reality, it's part of humanity. Even though one would wonder today, if you ask many Jews who are supposed to be very Torah devout Jews, is there room for diversity? They'll say, no, that's only my way. So where did that come from? That clearly is not from original Torah. So these questions are very critical ones because sadly, in a strange way, the more devout and the more observant and pious you find Jews today, sometimes the least tolerant they are in the paths of diversity, which makes you wonder. So here's so pious and so many mitzvahs, but when it comes to basic diversity that existed in the times of Har Sinai, the original Judaism, they don't relate to that. So then, and on the other hand, when you find people who are very open-minded, I'll call them more liberal-minded, very egalitarian and open to many different paths, usually find that they're not so devout and committed to the technical observance of many mitzvahs. I find this all the time, that the more spiritual people are, usually the less observant, and vice versa. So where did that dichotomy come from? Was Abraham not a spiritual person? Was he just a religious zealot, a fanatic? Hardly. He prayed for a wicked city of Sodom, so clearly he wasn't a suicide bomber. And he didn't dance and sing when wicked people were dying. He prayed for them. So I'm not going to go into the whole profile on Avraham Avinu and Abraham, but in exploring this, it's critical to challenge yourself. It comes down to, are you ready to challenge yourself and what you grew up with? And it's not always an easy thing to do because it could be very terrifying, because our comfort zones. And I say this not just to someone that's very observant, it's also to someone that's not. The real sign of a truly healthy, confident, and secure person who's committed to growth is, are they ready to challenge themselves? Are they open to new ideas? Can they see a different perspective? Doesn't mean you have to come to a different conclusion, but can you even hear a different perspective? And look at it. Now, for many, that's very scary, because if I look at another perspective, that may be a better one, and then I suddenly realize the choices I made, or not the choices that were made for me, not necessarily true ones. So of course there is a certain risk, but like anything in life, in business, the higher the risk, the greater the return. The less the risk, there will be no return. So yeah, people can make a choice to live a mechanical life, a comfortable life, and never question and never challenge, at the risk of really always remaining locked in your own narrow place and never really growing and reaching your real potential. On the other hand, open yourself up in your mind to other approaches, or at least to challenge yourself. It opens up the possibility for, yes, risks, but it also opens up a possibility for you to become a true human being, a true Jew, a true servant of God. And I met recently a Jew that I know many years. He's very devout, very grows up. He'll be the first to say, I live a double life. I have one life that's on the outside, that my family and community sees, and there's the other side that's my soul, which doesn't belong to Judaism, basically. Or the way he put it to me once, he said, I have Elokei Avosenu, not Elokeinu. In the prayer, we say God, our God, and the God of our parents. That's an expression. Elokeinu ve'elokei Aviseinu. And the question that can be asked is, it should be the other way, the order. First it's the God of your parents before it becomes your God. So why does the prayer say our God before it says Elokeinu Aviseinu? Because the answer is, because ultimately, yes, chronologically, you grow up in a home, your parents will be the first ones to teach you about God, or your educators. But at some point in life, you're supposed to own your choices, and it has to become Elokeinu. It has to become something you own, something that's yours. So it may come first from education, from outside of you, but at some point it has to be you. And if you don't reach that place, you have something that will be usually pretty, what they call in the Chassidic language, makivdik, pretty non-integrated, let's put it that way. So this guy told me, so I have Elokeinu Aviseinu, the God I have is the God of my parents, not my God. And this is not uncommon. So in the context of asking such questions, I came to the obvious conclusion, you can see obvious from what I do, that there was nothing to be afraid of asking these questions. If you go with an honest approach, and you're not looking, I'm not talking about, so there's unhealthy skepticism where a person is looking for an excuse to just not be committed to anything. No, so they challenge everything. I'm not talking about such skepticism. That skepticism is driven by personal interests, and a person wants to do whatever they want to do. A person just wants to do whatever they want, so they find philosophical excuses for anything. Anyone can do that. I'm talking about a healthy skepticism where you're just ready to ask questions, for sincerely looking for what is the greater answer. And what you come to learn is that not only is it acceptable, it's encouraged really. That if Avram Avinu was here and Moshe Rabbeinu were here, they would encourage questions, because it's part of God gave us a mind, and a mind thinks. And if you close off that part of yourself, and you close off your heart, and you close off basically all the rest of your faculties, then the question is, it says, God didn't create anything in this world for no use. So why did He give 248 organs and 365 nerves, and gave us mind and a heart and all the different faculties to use? And we use them in business and everywhere else to survive. Suddenly when it comes to soulful matters, we don't use them. It doesn't make any sense. And then when you learn, for example, that in Judaism, when the Jews stood at Sinai and they were told what the Torah has to say, so as opposed to other nations that asked to see what it says before they signed the contract, the Jews just signed the contract, Nasiv and Nishma. They said, we'll do and then we'll understand. And which the Talmud even describes a Roman philosopher that asks, how could this nation do something so reckless, so irresponsible? Would anyone sign a contract without reading it? It's just not responsible. Forget about whether it has any virtue of Kabbalah sale, of doing something because God said so. How do they know this contract has any merit? The answer, which again many people are not aware of, the answer is the Jews didn't meet God for the first time at Sinai. They were already dating a long time. They have Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov generations, 7 generations that had encounters with his God. So they were not an immature nation that just woke up one day all glassy-eyed and said, let's sign the contract. They'd seen elements of this contract. It says that the patriarchs fulfilled the Torah before it was given, so they knew what God expected of them. So it wasn't someone they had read the contract many times. However, now when it came to the time to really sign it, are you ready to make the move, or you still want to just stay without any commitment? And it is compared to like dating and marriage. Matan Torah is compared to a marriage, a wedding ceremony. So it didn't begin that day. So then when they're ready, yes, they're ready to make the commitment. They weren't going to say, let's read it all over again and let's see if we're comfortable with it or not. But the second half of it is also neglected. It says Nasa v'nishma. It doesn't say just Nasa. After the step of signing the commitment, there's also a step of understanding it. That's also part of the mitzvah. That's also part of the relationship with God. Not just to do, but also to understand. Da'asa l'kei avicha, to know God. V'yadaita Hashem l'kecha. There's a constant references in the Torah to knowing, not just to believing. And knowing requires thought, requires critical analysis, it requires a lot of effort and exertion. There's in the Pirkei Avot, there's 6 different chapters, 5, and they added a 6th chapter. The 2nd chapter begins with a very simple but also very a strange statement. It says Rebbe Eimer. That's how it begins. The Rebbe says, How should a person know what path to choose in life? And he continues. You'd think his answer would be, he should look in the Torah. And he'll know. No. He answers to look at whatever's teferes, adam, whatever's beautiful to him and to others, that's what is the right path to choose. And the obvious question is, the whole Torah is based on God gave us in guidelines how to live. The Torah is the path of life. Why suddenly here, Rabbi, who's Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, suddenly says the path is whatever's beautiful? That seems to counter everything. For whatever's beautiful, a lot of people would not necessarily choose all the mitzvahs for beauty. And the answer given to it is also very obvious, if you think about it. This is not chapter 1 of Pirkei Avos, it's chapter 2, and you're supposed to read it in order. Chapter 1 begins with Moshe Kibul Torah Sinai. First you begin, yes, we just accepted that the Torah came from Sinai. God gave us the Torah, and there's a Masorah, there's a chain of that passes on from teacher to student, generation after generation. That's the foundation, that it comes from Sinai. But now, like with Nasa and Ishma, after you have the Nasa, after you have that you accept that it comes from Sinai, comes step 2, to begin to make it a beautiful path. That it shouldn't just be something you do mechanically or dogmatically or because your parents said you should do it. Or whatever, because you're conforming to peer pressure and to social pressure. You have to make it something that is integrated. And here, yes, the path has to be one that is identifiably beautiful and kind, and something that you own and you beautify, not just what was given to you. And it's a combination. Judaism is a combination of a God-given path, but God wants us to integrate it into our lives. That's why there's no one solution for everybody. You could have the same mitzvah, you could say the same prayer, Shema Yisrael, in literally infinite amount of ways. Just like you can play the same piece of music in infinite amount of ways. If you're mechanical, you just say it the same way again and again, and you don't think about it. But if you're not mechanical, you see the prayers as musical notes, then you say the same words, same notes, but you say it with a different intention. And the same person should be not saying it twice ever the same way, because it always has a different meaning for where you are in your life at that point. So in this long introduction, which in Judaism sometimes introductions are the destination too, is really about what is the challenge of our times. I find this, as I said, once I began to discover that there's the second half, it's not just the mechanical body of Judaism, but there's also the soul. I didn't just commit to it. I decided that that I have to do whatever I can to help bring that message, that secret out there. So I've become this like establishment, anti-establishment guy, where I'm not trusted in both worlds, which is fine with me. And I don't know if I'm exaggerating or not, but some people would identify it that way. And trying to bridge these two worlds. So I've been doing this for many, many years, teaching, writing, trying to understand what Abraham would look like today. And maybe we should start figuring out. I would submit that if Abraham came around today, he'd probably be excommunicated in some communities. Others wouldn't believe that it's him. And he ended up being anyway somewhere, some type of loner, just like he was in his time. And that's my guess. And until maybe a few people would discover that, hey, he's the real thing, and maybe we're not the real thing. But the arrogance of many religious people is that we think we're real. We wouldn't even believe it's Abraham. And even if they did, they'd say something's wrong, Now, instead of challenging themselves and saying, 1 second, he's the father of it all. Maybe something wrong with you, not with him. But that we'll leave for another time. We'll maybe do one day a play or something like that with a little humor. So people, you can get away with it because they'll think it's a comedy, but in truth, it'll be deeper truth. What do you think? Want to do something? Want to produce a Hollywood called Abraham? Will the real Abraham stand up? Huh? But since there's a theme for this discussion here, I want to bring it to. So how do you see relevance in every detail of the Torah? And I say relevance, as I said, going back to what I said earlier, psychological, personal, emotional. And to me, it comes down to empowerment. If the Torah cannot compete, just like in business, they say the customer is always right. If the Torah can't compete in the open marketplace of ideas, psychology, spirituality, emotional ideas, then there's something wrong. And we look at it this way: Imreiku, the Yerushalmi says, Mikemhu, that if you don't figure it out, it's not the problem in the book; it's the problem with you. That's how I see it. The Torah, hafachba v'hafachba, it says everything is there. So if we don't find that type of psychological relevance, the way an honest person should think is maybe your problem with you, not with the book. So if you delve and you look deeper, you'll find it. And that's the challenge. How do you look at a parsha, a chapter, that you may have read your entire life thousands of times and know it inside out, or you may have never read it and don't see any relevance in it in the first place? How do you bring it alive in a way that is relevant to personal lives? Which of course requires, firstly, just simply thinking out of the box and applying a theme to a real life issue. So I look at this week's chapter, and as I said, I grew up with it. I read it I don't know how many times. Before I ever ask questions and after I ask questions. Every Shabbos you read it, once every year, once at least, and then you learn it in yeshiva, and then you learn it different times throughout the year. It comes up again and again. When you're a student, you're going to read these chapters again and again, different verses, different sections, different commentaries. And it's a very rich study. I can tell you can spend your whole life just reading this chapter, Vayechi, with all the commentaries. It could also take you a good few months. And then when you go into the counter comment, all the levels of it, it's literally unlimited. Which doesn't necessarily help the situation, because you can get so distracted by the technical commentaries that you forget about the relevance. And that also happens to people. They're masters of the text and its commentaries, but if you ask them, can you tell me what it means to me in my life now, they look at you like you're off the wall. That's not the point. When in truth Torah is Melashon Hera, the word Torah itself, the meaning of the word, what does it mean? It means Hera, it comes from a word. The Radak and other commentators who explain the roots of Hebrew words, Torah comes from Hera. Hera means directive, instruction. It's an instruction. Now, everyone can relate to instructions like the Ten Commandments. Do that, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. But what's the instruction when you read Vayechi Yaakov Be'eretz Mitzrayim? There's no instruction. It just says Yaakov lived in Egypt for 17 years. There's no mitzvah there. There's no instruction. No one even suggests there's an instruction. So 90% of the Torah doesn't have mitzvahs. The words. Yes, there are 613 mitzvahs scattered throughout the 5 books, but you can't say every letter, every word. So why is it all called Torah? Why is it all instruction? This is also what they call a klotz kasha. So the answer is that we're missing the point. That's exactly the commentaries are all critical to analyze and understand the verses, and they're all valuable. But the bottom line that has to come down to some hamaisa hu'eika le'amedrash, not the study but the action that it brings. So just going with that approach forces you to ask the question: if one accepts the Torah as a blueprint or authority, what is the blueprint? What is the message to me when I read this story? So Jacob, yes, he lived close to 3,500 years ago, and he lived 147 years, as we read. And the last 17 years of his life begins this chapter. He lived in Egypt, and that's where he passes away. And the rest of the story of this week's chapter is how he prepares for his passing. He calls his children, first Joseph, and gives him his instructions where he wants to be buried. He blesses Joseph's children. Then the rest of the brothers come together, the tribes, they're all there, and he blesses them and gives them his instructions. And the story continues more or less mostly about Jacob's last days, last moments of his life and the blessings that he gave. And then at the end of the chapter concludes how Jacob passes away, and then how all the tribes pass away, and how Joseph passes away. And it concludes with Joseph's passing and how he makes the promise that the Jews, when they would leave Egypt, they should make sure to take him with them. And that's how it ends. And as Aaron, that his casket remained in Egypt, as opposed to Jacob's, who was buried in Israel at his request. So you have a story, it has a lot of beautiful messages, a lot of poetry, especially the blessings to the tribes, which has a lot of cryptic meaning. If you're someone that follows Rashi there, you'll see very large, long commentaries from Rashi because the words are very difficult to understand. But overall, the message and lessons, yes, so if you go to different, what they call Dvar Torahs or sermons rabbis give, people give this lesson, some are very good at connecting it to contemporary events. I'm sure there'll be rabbis that will connect this to Bernie Madoff's son's suicide, or whatever else is happening. I haven't even read the news lately, but whatever is going on in the world. And then there are many sermons that will be, of course, hollow and empty and have no message to anyone. and so on and so forth. And everyone in their own creative way tries to make some sense of it. But the real question is, what is the real underlying message that we all can learn from it? Not just some cute connection. Something like, why is it really important for us to know that Jacob lived this long, and how he lived and what he lived? So there are many ways to tackle this. I was going to tackle it one particular way, as we sent out in the email, the secret to immortality. So let me begin with this. One of the things that stands out right immediately is the name of the chapter, Vayechi. A name in Judaism always is all-encompassing. It's all-encompassing because a name is like a name of a person. When you say a person has intelligence, or is emotional, or is shrewd, or is common sense, or is abstract, or whatever it is, or is artistic, these are descriptions of what's called adjectives. It's called a shem hatoyar. So you're describing what the person is like. But when you say the name of something, you're saying this is the totality of the person is named so-and-so. So in Hebrew, names are very significant in that sense. So name, Vayechi, is the name of the chapter. Who gave the names exactly, we're not sure, because definitely does not come straightly from Moshe Rabbeinu. The names are usually associated with the first words or letters in the chapter, but the names are precise for sure, because, for example, the second chapter in the Torah is called Noach, even though the words are Ela Teldus Noach. A chapter later is called Teldus, even though it says Ela Teldus Yitzchak. So if you think about it, the first one should have been called Teldus, because it's an earlier chapter, and the next one should have been called Yitzchak. Instead, the first one is called Noach, and the other one is called Teldus. This is not an accident. So clearly there is significance of why chapters have different names. So the name Vayechi, in a way, captures the story of this chapter, because it's about the life of Jacob. It's the sum total of his life, the end of the book, how he finishes his life, and how he blesses, and how the next generation continues. But if you go a little deeper, you look a little further, when it actually talks about Jacob's passing, so there's a few verses that describe his passing. And the Talmud jumps on a very, very glaring omission. It doesn't say anywhere that Jacob died. It says, Vayechi Yaakov, Jacob lived for 17 years, but when it comes to death, usually the Torah will say Vayamos, or there's other expressions. But by Jacob, it doesn't say any expression of Vayamos, which in Hebrew means misa, death. It says that he passed out. It says that they embalmed him. They consoled each other. They eulogized him. All that. But actual death is not mentioned. So the Talmud says, an interesting thing. It says, Yaakov Avinu lo mes, that Jacob did not die. So the Talmud asks, what do you mean he didn't die? They buried him. They eulogized him. They embalmed him. They eulogized him. So what do you mean he didn't die? So the Talmud answers, Mazari b'chaim, avhu b'chaim. Just like his children are alive, so too he's alive. That's the Talmud. Now, of course, everyone jumps on that as well, the commentaries. So what's so unique about Jacob? Abraham also had children, and so did Isaac, and so did almost every great Jewish leader had children. So none of them should say the word death, because Mazari b'chaim, avhu b'chaim. They all had children. So good, you could argue with Abraham that he had two children and one child was Esav, and he wasn't exactly continuing the legacy. Same with Yitzchak. That one child was Yishmael by Abraham, and by Yotzim and Yishmael. Or by Isaac, one child was Esav. Whereas by Yaakov, it says Mitoshe Shlema, that all his children were tzaddikim, were righteous people. So you could say Mazari. But it's not exactly a complete answer, because firstly, maybe Isaac and Jacob and Abraham not, but later on there are many, many people who had children that were all tzaddikim as well. And still, is this enough reason? Even if you have one child that continues your legacy, the logic is the same. That the children continue who you are, so you don't die, because your message, who more than Abraham? Abraham was the first of them all. Till this day, you could say we are children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and just as we live on and continue their traditions, so too they should live on. So why is Yaakov singled out and the Torah doesn't call him death? And what does it really mean that he's not? When the Torah actually saying Yaakov Avinu lo mes, it's a very strong statement. It's one thing saying the legacy of someone continues on, their spirit continues on. To say that he really didn't die is clearly something unique here. And to go further, if you talk about spirituality in general, the soul doesn't die. No one's soul dies. If you're talking about the soul of Jacob, which soul dies? A soul never dies. Only a body dies. Why does the soul not die? Because the soul is not born. Based on basic ABCs of spirituality, especially Jewish thought, it says neshama, before it came down to earth, the soul was in heaven, in its own place, whatever that means, in the spiritual plane. And then it came down into a body. God chooses and sends it to a particular family, a particular body. And it lives, the soul and the body live together for whatever amount of years, 120 years. In case of Yaakov, 147 years, but whatever the amount. And then they part ways. So the body is placed in the earth and buried. And the soul returns to where it originated from. So no soul dies. The whole concept of death is a physical concept. It's a physical concept based on our understanding of time and space, where physical things come to an end. But the spirit of something doesn't die. Even in basic physics and science, energy never dies. You can take this table and put it into a fireplace and burn it to embers and never know it's a table, but it doesn't disappear. The table has now been converted into flames, which in turn are converted into gas, and somewhere that gas still remains in existence. You can't actually even destroy anything completely. Everything leaves some energy, some radioactivity. It doesn't mean it looks the way it looks the way it was in its original state, but this is one of the basics of modern physics. Einstein proved matter equals energy. E equals mc squared, to be precise. That all matter is energy and all energy can be turned into matter. They're reversible. So you can take a gas and turn it into a solid, a liquid and then into a solid, and vice versa. But you can never destroy them. The example would be, for example, a vapor. Vapor, water, and ice. They're all three the same thing in three different forms. When you freeze it, it becomes ice. When you melt it, it's water. When you heat it, it becomes vapor. It becomes a gas. And they're reversible. Vapor can be turned into water, which can be turned into ice, and back and forth many, many times. It's actually the whole process of how this earth exists. What the oceans do. And we learn Ve'ed Yalam min ha'aretz, what dew does. The waters evaporate, they turn into clouds. The clouds in turn produce rain. And the process, it's like a literally washing machine that continues cleansing itself. I mean, I'm just using a simple example, but the same is true with everything in existence. So if you really put it that way, nothing dies. So what are we talking about here, Yaakov Avinu? You're not talking about his body, because his body clearly was buried. So we're talking about his soul. So then his soul, then everybody is in the same situation. So this is obviously the theme of many commentaries, and people discuss it in different ways. But I want to address it in a personal way, in a very personal way. As I said, we could talk about it in a very theoretical way, you know, what it means, and the different explanations and counter-explanations. But I want to address it in a personal way. One of the biggest aspirations of human beings from the beginning of time has been the search for immortality. Exactly this, to live forever. The pharaohs of Egypt, actually the pyramids, were built as a way of, they thought that would be immortality. That if they could take their bodies and embalm them, which means the body would not decompose, and they actually had, many of the pharaohs had their brides and their wives buried alive with them, they thought that was their immortality. They worshipped the body and they did not relate to a soul. And if you could have the body forever remain in this type of suspension, that was in their mind immortality. And they didn't just talk about it, they built big pyramids in that kind. A small version of it was a communist Soviet Union. There's Lenin's tomb. Go there, you'll see what they do to it. The body is intact just as the day he died, which was 1923, 24. They have all kinds of chemicals and whatever it is. The body is completely, you look at it, they say it's exactly as he looked when he died. How they're doing it, I don't really know what they use, but they do it. Now, what the point of it exactly, you can argue about it. For Jews, obviously this is not just repulsive, it's prohibited completely. As a matter of fact, burial has to be immediate, and you don't do anything to the body. You put it exactly, El Offer Atav, El Offer Toshuv. We came out of the earth, and we return to the earth. Like God gives you a gift, you return it the way it was given to you as best as you can. I mean, there's a thing called tahara, we clean it, but we don't do any type of stuff of trying to preserve anything or any type of other things. Today you have also the cryogenic experimentations. There are people paying millions of dollars to have their, immediately upon death, to have their blood drained from them, and they put in this type of cryogenic fluid to keep them in frozen animation until the day they hope that one day human beings will figure out how to revive, maybe through DNA. If you saw Jurassic Park or any of these science fiction movies, they say you can take a hair, someone that lived 1,000 years ago, and from that hair you can, through the DNA, some argue that with time scientists will be able to create life from the DNA that's embedded even in, we have in Judaism, Chut HaShedr, you have the Etzem Luz. They say even when a body decomposes completely, there's still a bone that always remains intact. They say Tchias HaMesim, resurrection will come from that. But that's another story, whether resurrection is a scientific possibility or is it a miracle. There are actually books that have been written lately that talk about resurrection as a very scientific possibility. Not today, but when time. It's another discussion. That's not what I'm getting into here at all. So this search for immortality, from the pharaohs of old even till today, and you could say it even affects the whole. I think that one of the biggest industries in the world today is the pharmaceutical industry, and not for colds and viruses and allergies, but for Botox and cosmetics, simply to preserve age, meaning to try to abort or to slow down the aging process. Billions and billions of dollars are spent on that. Even if people know that it's not going to last forever, if it lasts a year, a month, even if it may be damaging today and cause more and more aging later, people are ready to go crazy just for the look. Because we worship youth and we are terrified of aging and the erosion that everything that mortality brings. So in a way, it's also a search for immortality. It's not quite extreme of immortality. Nobody's thinking that by certain cosmetics you're going to live forever. But I'm sure someone with a good marketing skill can plant that seed as well. May not look for, you're not going to live forever, but you look like you live forever. That type of thing. Till the day you die, you look like you're still 20 years old. And I'm not getting into what your opinion is about people who are 85 years old and their faces have been stretched so many ways. We all have our thoughts on this matter, and the grotesque part of it and stuff like that. But it's just, my point here is more the psychological need that people have to try to stop death, or what we call the process that leads to death, aging. The Rabbeinu Bechai writes, "Atinuk misheneled maskal yisyovish," that a child, as soon as it's born, it begins to age. It begins to dry up. Remember, you don't begin to age when you're 80. You begin to age when you're day one. However, the process takes time till it's obvious. The wrinkles don't come for another 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, or depending on what cosmetics you use. But naturally, but you wouldn't have wrinkles if you didn't have the first 10 years of your life of frowning or doing other things. So clearly aging doesn't begin later, it just becomes obvious later. So in truth, what the Rabbeinu Bechai is saying is an obvious truth. Everything physical starts dying right away. It just takes time till it finishes dying, but starts right away. That's why when we talk about a concept like Vayechi, or Mayim Chaim, not as in the soda drink, but as in its original root, Mayim Chaim refers to the highest level of a mikveh. That in Judaism, there's the Jewish thought, there are different ways to purify from impurity. So you have different types. You have a mikveh, a literal mikveh, which is a body of still water, disconnected from its source. So it has the power for certain impurities to purify. But there are things in Torah that must have Mayim Chaim. It means it has to be live water. I mean a live spring connected to a mayon, connected to some live source. Like the Arizal's mikveh, for example, in Tzfat is connected to a live spring. There are mikvahs in the world that are connected to a live spring. They're not just a body of water that's been stored from rain or from others. A real body of real live water. When is that necessary? To purify, for example, from tumas mes, from the impurity of death. But without getting into the technicalities of it, the question is, what is Mayim Chaim? So there's a Mishnah, there's a whole tractate in the Talmud that talks about these different types of water, what makes something alive. So here's an interesting Talmud, a Mishnah, in Torah. It's a tractate, only of Mishnayos, of Mishnah. It says like this: what makes something Mayim Chaim? What, for example, let's say you have a well, a live spring of water, that wells go dry. What happens if a well will go dry? Is it chayim? How do you know when you see a live spring that it's actually called life? Maybe tomorrow it's going to dry up. So the Mishnah says it has to be running live for 7 years. If it's less than 7 years live spring, you don't consider it to be live. Once it hits 7 years, it has the chazakah, it has like you can basically depend on the likelihood that it will continue to be live. So in other words, if you think about what this means, it means that something to be called real life, mayim chaim, alive water, to be really alive, you don't wait till after the 7 years. It means if it's going to die in 7 years from now, even now you can't really call it life. So really, the definition of life is not at the end of life, it's at the beginning of life. In other words, life is defined by quality, not by quantity. Something lives 200 years doesn't make it more alive than something that lives 5 years. Because it's just a matter of quantity. Something to be alive, truly alive, has to be qualitative alive. Which means that even from the first day, it can be dying already. And if you could establish that, however you can establish it, that's called true life. There's many things in Jewish thought that are this way, that if something's going to happen tomorrow, called mechusar maisa or mechusar zman. If something's going to happen tomorrow to something, even today it's compromised, basically. You don't have to wait for it to happen to assume that it's weak. So in other words, just like I said with the Bechai, what he said that a child begins to die or begins to age from first day, that's exactly right. He's not the same death that will affect his grandfather is going to affect him. It's just a matter of time. That's on a very basic physical level. So we have this obsession, human beings, with immortality. Sometimes you hear the search for the fountain of youth. In fairy tales, you have people who searched all over the world for the fountain of youth. They were looking for this fountain, mayim chaim, fountain, that if you drink from it, you forever stay young. And you have novels and stories and songs, and everyone in their own particular way. Think about it. Most of us do not feel like we're dying. We don't feel like we're aging. You ask a person who's like 60, 70 years old, he's not going to say, or she's going to say, I feel closer to death than you do. They may feel weak. They may logically know that their life expectancy is shorter than a 5-year-old, obviously. But the feeling that you have right now, you don't feel every day passes a day closer to death. Thank God we don't feel that way. We feel, unless there may be times where we get very scared or something happens to us, but generally in a healthy situation, you feel like you're going to live forever. It's like, why shouldn't you? Your mind tells you, obviously, that, God forbid things happen. God forbid we don't know our day and time. But that's logical. Emotionally, you feel you're here and you're not going anywhere. Just like you also don't feel you come from somewhere. Who feels that they're an extension from those that came before us? If you look in the mirror, you see you have what they call a pupik, a belly button, a navel. You know that's a sign, the only sign that you once were connected by an umbilical cord to your mother. Some people psychologically are still connected, but emotionally, most of us are just self-standing people. That's why the mitzvah kabedes avicha v'semecha, you need a mitzvah, and it doesn't come that easy, as most people can tell you. If you just felt that you were an extension of your parents, emotionally, you wouldn't even need such a mitzvah. Obviously, you're going to honor the source of your life, or what is giving you life right now. You're not going to dishonor it. It's because we don't feel connected. You have to be told, you have to apply yourself, that these are your parents, even if it's not always the way you like it. You have to honor them, which is another discussion, but just proves the point that we are like these self-contained, almost feel like we're self-created, self-created human beings. So the search for immortality is something that, as I said, has obsessed people. And in our own case, just to give you a little some context. For example, the Buddhists in Tibet, there's a book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's one of the most sacred books in Buddhist thinking. And it's all about how Buddhists think about death. For them, life on earth, as we know it, is just a stage and not real. And they're one of the fundamental principles of Buddhist philosophy. I know you didn't come here to hear Buddhist philosophy, but that's not my point. You did come? Oh. Right. Oh, I thought that's what you said. You did come to hear. Because I'm not a Buddhist expert by no means, but I'm saying it out of context. Yisin er min acheshach, as they say. So in Buddhism, the main thing is that all fears of human beings comes down to the fear of death, the fear of annihilation, the end. That you, as you know yourself, your ego, your power, your influence will come to an end. That is the driving fear in every other fear. That's Buddhist thinking. I mean, there's a lot of arguments that confirm that, because look how far people will go for kavod, for honoring themselves, how much money they'll spend to make a mark, to make a monument, to be honored. People go very far to be remembered. So you can argue a direct proportion to how you see how much we invest to be remembered. You can imagine how much fear we have not to be remembered. And you could say that is a very powerful force in people, and not necessarily conscious. It doesn't mean you sit around thinking about it the whole time. Not all fear is conscious. It could be unconscious fear. That's their thinking. And therefore, part of Buddhist goal is to get rid of that fear by understanding that there's no such thing as death. This whole world, this whole life is a very temporary thing. Physicality by its very nature is not alive. And actually, real life begins when your body disappears. I mean, I'm simplifying it. So if you can come to such a realization, you get rid of the fear. Now, there are some similarities in Judaism, some people argue, because in Judaism you also say the whole world is a pruzdur. This world, this material world, all it is a hall, is a preparation to Elam Haba, to the world to come. So if you really believe that, that helps you not get so consumed with Elam Haza, with all the material things, because all this is just a preparation. There's a famous song, Kol Elam Kula, the whole world is just a small bridge, and the main thing is not to be afraid. And many argue that's a similar concept, the concept of realizing materialism has no real value, you can't take your money with you. Now, the fact that it's a challenge, yes, because we live in this world and we are consumed with it. But philosophically, if we can train ourselves to realize that materialism doesn't have any true value, the goal is ultimate spirituality, and the neshama will live on forever and ever in Gan Eden. So you have to prepare the ground and all your mitzvahs, all your good deeds, prepare your share in the world to come. This is very mainstream, called normative Jewish thinking. There are some fundamental problems with it, because, and this is the biggest problem of all, you may be familiar that there's a machlekes, there's a disagreement between the Rambam, Maimonides, and Nachmanides, Ramban, what the ultimate reward in Judaism is. The Rambam holds exactly as I just said, that the ultimate reward is spiritual reward, because the body is inferior to the soul. So we do live in this world. We will be rewarded ultimately in spiritual reward. However, there is a stage where we will go through resurrection, Tchis HaMesim, so the body will get some reward, but then after that, everyone will revert to souls and there will be no longer bodies and any physical world. That's the Rambam's Shita approach. The Ramban, Nachmanides, disagrees, and the Psak, which means the ruling, is this latter ruling. All of Kabbalah and Hasidus and basically mainstream Judaism rejects the Rambam. And the Ramban's position, Nachmanides, is that it's true the soul will get its reward in Gan Eden. But when we say Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelik Le'elam Haba, when it says that everybody has a share in the world to come, it does not refer to Gan Eden, spiritual worlds. It refers to the world after resurrection, when there will be souls and bodies on this earth forever and ever. Eternal life on this earth. Basically, the Rambam is saying immortality of the soul, and the body is not immortal, and the Ramban holds that the soul and body as well will be immortal. The fact that we don't understand it doesn't work according to the rules of nature today is irrelevant. It's a new world then. Elam Chadash, new rules. The same God that created these rules will change the rules. And there's explanations for this as well, that if a body would be so saturated with spirituality, why should it ever have to die? Think of it like a cup of water. Well, if you put water in a cup, and let's ignore for a moment the power of evaporation. Why is there any reason the water should ever run out of the cup? No. So the question is asked, when Adam and Eve were created, it says that they would live forever. It says the opposite, that when the day you will eat from this tree of knowledge, good and evil, that day you will die. Or not that day, but from then on you will bring death into this world. So the question is asked, what would have happened had they not eaten from the tree? They would have lived forever. In bodies, not in souls. Vayipach Ba'apav, it says, Vayikach Offer min Adam, a body of earth would have a soul. So that one of the explanations that can be used to explain it is this same idea. Why should a soul ever have to leave a body? Think of it, electricity inside of an appliance. The only reason electricity should ever have to leave the appliance would be if the appliance wears down or breaks. Electricity doesn't run out of energy. The water will stay in the cup unless you puncture the cup or you pour out the water. So the way you can explain it is when Adam and Eve made the first sin, what they did was they punctured their bodies. They now made that the body is no longer aligned with the soul. Basically, this appliance from here on is going to wear down. And one day it will not be able to contain the energy or the electricity or the water of the soul inside it. The soul continues on, but the body can no longer continue. So you could argue that one day, through all our mitzvahs and through all our good deeds, we'll fix all these punctures. So the cup will be repaired, the appliance is fixed, and why shouldn't the appliance then forever join with the soul? And that's exactly what the Ramban says. So that's real immortality. I'm not here to make a case for it. Obviously you'll say, well, it's not something according to the laws of nature, as I just pointed out. I'm just stating these opinions. So now let's go back to this whole theme of immortality and stuff, and Yaakov and so on. On a very more basic level, and I'll get back to this in a few minutes. If your child asks you a simple question, and my child has asked me this, and I was a child, I asked this, but it's also an adult question. But children usually ask more honest questions than adults, as I pointed out. Your child asks you this question. You teach me, mommy or tati, mother or father, to be a good person. No? And that I should be virtuous and giving and not selfish. But here's my question. At the end of it, we're all going to die. And good people and bad people are both going to be buried in the same earth, with really making no difference in the big picture. What difference does it make if I'm today a better person? Another day, 10 days, 1,000 years even. When at the end of it, we're all going to die. And everything we did will seemingly also die. I've asked this question to many, many audiences, literally, I would say tens of thousands of people, just to hear people's responses. So the usual response everybody gives, I'll give you the few answers everyone says. First answer is often, it's just the right thing to do. Doesn't matter what's going to be later. You have to be a good person. The fact you don't understand what's going to happen later, it doesn't matter. You have to do the right thing. And being a good person, even though you pay a price, selfishness sometimes seems to be rewarded, but that's what you have to do. Others say it makes you feel good. Being a good person makes you feel good, so it doesn't really matter. For now you felt good. That's it. I can go on and on. There's all kinds of answers given. But in truth, all of these answers are very weak, obviously, because they're very arbitrary. What happens if I don't care, if I don't feel so good? Some people feel very good not being so kind. So I'll be selfish. And if I don't think really what's going to happen later, it weakens, so it doesn't really make a difference. Here, as a child in my class, let's say the child is like a weak child, and all the kids are making fun. So I could choose to make fun of this kid, or I could choose to protect the child and be nice. So yeah, for the moment, I did a nicer thing, but what difference does it make? Is there a real difference? So they have the classic analogy, I think in Chicken Soup of the Soul, or one of these books, where someone is walking on a beach, and they're throwing clams, live clams that came out of the water, and were beached and grounded, throwing them back in the water so they shouldn't die. So some cynic comes by and says, you know how many clams there are on the beach? There are millions of them. What difference does it make? You throw another clam in. There's another million you're not going to throw. And he says, it makes a difference to this clam. Yeah, it doesn't make a difference but in the numbers game, but it makes a difference to this clam. So you can make that argument as well, that for this moment you did something. But there is a philosophical weakness still in all these answers. And I'm sure there are more answers. I'm not going to go through all of them. What is ultimately the Torah answer for this? So there's a line in Tanya. This is a classic work of Chabad Chassidus, but it's not just from Tanya. The Shalah writes it and others, but he puts it in very succinct terms. It says like this, that when a person does a mitzvah, yichud zeh, yichud nifla, nitzchi la'elam v'ad. That when a person does a mitzvah, a kind thing, a right thing, mitzvah includes everything, all mitzvahs, but includes also doing something right, kind. This yichud, the unity the energy that it releases is forever. Immediately the word is the word immortal. It's forever. In other words, when Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and our grandparents, because let's take the question, make it even stronger. There are people who died for Judaism. It wasn't just a game of throwing another clam in or not. They died for Judaism. It wasn't just being nice. They died for their faith. There are people who would not bow down to an idol, would not in any way compromise their own Judaism at the risk of death, and actual death too. Hundreds and thousands of stories. During the Holocaust, during the pogroms, during the Crusades, during the Inquisitions, during the whole list. You go through all of history, and you find stories and stories. Whole cities, entire cities in France, in Germany, Middle Europe, all over. And not one. Abraham himself allowed himself to be thrown into a oven, to a furnace. The list goes on and on and on. So you ask yourself the question, was it worth it? Why would someone give away their life? I mean, there's nothing more valuable than life. You know, someone will say, look, I have children at home. So good, they called me and they said, bow down to this little getchka, this little idol. No one's going to know if I bow down or not. If I'm going to let myself be killed, my children will not have a father or a mother to provide for them. What's worse? That I bow to this little thing, or that I should leave my children orphans? And parents, and many allowed themselves to be killed. And it was an exception that someone didn't. It was very uncommon. And usually it was not necessarily for their children, it was usually for their own self-interest. But it seems illogical. The Torah itself values life above everything. Pikuach nefesh, it says, Deicha kol ha'Torah kula. That if there's a threat to life, the whole Torah basically is abrogated. On Yom Kippur, if there's even a suffix, a doubt that you need to eat something, even if you have nothing but pork, on Yom Kippur, we're not supposed to, when all these are fundamental prohibitions, not only is it considered to be not a desecration of Yom Kippur, it's, as some commentaries say, it's actually a sanctification of Yom Kippur, because it says, V'chai bahem. You should live with these mitzvahs, not die by them. So you're actually sanctifying Yom Kippur if you desecrate it to save a life. So Torah values life. Torah is not reckless with life and just says, do a mitzvah. Except for 3 instances. Murdering someone, incest or some sexual depravity, perversion, and idolatry. So murder, most of us can understand. If you're going to murder, if someone says, I'll kill you unless you kill that person, you have to give up your life for that. Because you're desecrating another life by killing that person for your own comfort. But idolatry, you could say, hey, what's so big thing? Idolatry, good. It's a cardinal sin, another god, etc., etc. So I don't want to go into the discussion why idolatry is such a big crime. There is a very good explanation for it, and why it's the root of all the mitzvahs. It's the second commandment, etc. But what I was discussing was, why would they give their lives? And they gave their lives not just for not desecrating their own faith. They gave their lives to save a Sefer Torah in a burning synagogue. I mean, you can't imagine the sacrifices that Jews made. So if they all die at the end, whether you sacrifice or not, what difference does it make? That's why it's not such a small question. The answer is that absolutely it lives on forever. For 1 second, if you were to say that all the prices that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel and Leah, and all the millions of people after them that gave their lives, and giving their lives doesn't always mean dying. It's also giving their lives, living hard lives on earth to preserve their religion. If all that goes with their grave to their grave, you could basically throw out the whole Judaism. Because what's the point? So in other words, being good and kind and doing a mitzvah is not just about now. Yes, you may not see its effects. It's about changing the world forever. And there's no question that Abraham and all these people knew in their hearts that the world is changed by their actions. It makes no difference whether they will see it with their eyes in their lifetime or not. And there's no question that Jews that marched to the gas chambers and sang Ani Mamin or said Shema Yisrael and Kaddish were not insane. But they said to themselves, you can take our bodies, but you can't take our souls. Because if it won't be us, it will be our children. And if it won't be our children, it will be our grandchildren. There's no doubt that was in the minds of Jews. That's why no one wanted to give their life for faith, obviously. It's not exactly something you pursue. But if push came to shove, yes, a father and a mother would rather have a child remain a physical orphan, but not a spiritual orphan. Because if that father and mother goes home, even if no one will ever know that they bowed to an idol, they had compromised the whole eternity of it all for immediate comfort. Of course, who wants to leave a child an orphan? Obviously, that's the greatest tragedy. But there's a greater one, that there will be no future altogether. Yes, you can live on one generation or two, but once faith is gone, once the commitment is gone, it doesn't live on anyway. It'll die regardless. So Jews had, they called the big picture in mind, even when they were living the small picture. Today, all this is almost like fantasy because we don't have to pay such prices. Today, it doesn't cost anything. There's no one arresting us for giving a class, for learning, for sending our kids to Jewish schools. It doesn't exist, these challenges. But in history, it did exist. So you go back now to the essential theme is that we see very little about what lives on and what doesn't live on. Because if I said all this speech that I just gave now, 4,000 years ago, so if you were a cynic or a skeptic, you could say, yeah, it's very nice thoughts, very nice ideas, but let's see what happens. Let's go the other way around. Today we're 4,000 years, almost 4,000 years since Abraham lived. And it did bear itself out. Abraham's children know who their grandfather is. And Nimrod's children don't know who their grandfather is. The Romans, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Spanish Empire, you name it, everybody. From the beginning, the Egyptians. They have not one descendant. There's no one that even claims that they're a grandson of Pharaoh or of Julius Caesar or of Aristotle. I'm not even talking about the bad guys, the good guys. No one even claimed it because there was never part of their life to create such a legacy. Aristotle was a brilliant man. You read his books, brilliant. But he wasn't interested in leaving grandchildren that followed his path. He would have liked it. But he was caught in the fame of the moment and the brilliance of the moment and did not think about immortality. So the interesting paradox is Pharaoh, who tried to be immortal and he had all the resources to do whatever he needed to build pyramids, doesn't end up having any immortality. Yeah, we find these old mummies, in that sense, yes, but you don't have any grandchildren, and definitely don't have grandchildren that are living by the same principles that he lived. So you talk about immortality, you see we have to rephrase and reframe the whole words. What does it mean? Most of us think of immortality in terms of, as I said, not aging. If you can take some Botox or some other stuff and a lip tuck here and a whatever it's called, not a lip tuck, a belly tuck, a lip suction, and all these type of things. I remember I was once on a cruise. It was a Jewish cruise with Chazanim. So I decided I had enough of the Chazanim. I went and snuck out to the other side of the boat where there was the called Goyish entertainment. And there was a comedian, a Chinese comedian. And I remember one joke he made. It's the only thing I remember, actually. He was like a real Chinese, and he said, these Americans are very... No, he made two things, he said. The Americans are very strange, he said, with his Chinese accent. Only in America, he said. For example, you get a phone call. Are you in debt? Yes. How much? $100,000? I can get you out of debt. How? By taking a loan. He says, only in America. That was one thing. You think about it. The second thing is you go on a date with a woman, and you could see in her face and everything how many times she's been remade and plastic surgery and all that. And the main thing is then she says to you, but I want you to get to know the real me. She says, this is in America. Anyway, these that I remember, the real me. So the truth is, when you talk about words like immortality, you see, the arrogance of materialism is such. When we talk about immortal, we talk about preserving my ego, preserving my being. Okay, so you do it either through pyramids, or through embalmment, or through the cryogenic, freezing liquids, or all the other physical methods. But the real definition of immortality, that's why I brought Mayim Chaim, is nothing to do with physicality. It has to do with an immortal concept, an immortal commitment. Love is immortal. A person that loves somebody, even after that person dies, doesn't stop loving them. Maybe you move on, and practical reasons, a person may remarry, or other things. But you don't cease loving somebody because love is not defined by physical things. What's more immortal than that? My father passed away 5.5 years ago. I'm not looking for another father. My father is my father. Forever I will love him, as long as I have consciousness. It has nothing to do with being physical. Yes, of course, it would be nice if I could touch him and nice I could speak to him. But real immortal things, if you really think about it, have nothing to do with tangibility. The interesting thing with Judaism, as I said with the Ramban, is when you appreciate that, then you can even infuse the physical with immortality. So the paradox is, as soon as you stop worshipping the body, and you understand that immortality comes from the soul, you then can bring that immortality back to the body. That's what they didn't know. The pharaohs didn't know that. And all these guys that try to immortalize themselves, they immortalized their bodies. And that's all they knew. To use an expression, you may have heard, in halacha there's a word called bittul. But I'm not using it from a halachic term. Bittul means when something is subjugated to something else. But in Hasidic terminology or in Kabbalistic terminology, bittul is a very profound and very powerful concept. It's not weakness, it's strength. What is bittul? Bittul is the ability to suspend yourself in face of something greater than yourself. It's the secret to all growth, to all love, to all immortality. Simple as that. And I'll show you how. I'll use the Chelim story that I often tell to capture it. You all know the city called Chelim? It's also immortal. There's in its own way. There's a Chelim everywhere. Every little community has its Chelim. Shtibel. So, some pronounce it Chelim, but Chelim. They say they were wise people in Chelim, actually. But the neighbors were very resentful, so they created this whole folklore of the stupid people of Chelim. So Chelim, there was a farm. And you can imagine a city like Chelim, a shtetl like Chelim, had a farm that wasn't very large. But the farmer that owned this farm in Chelim, the only farm, for him it was very special because it was like his baby. He inherited it from his parents, and he knew every grain of soil, and he took care of it, nurtured it. One day he gets a visitor from a big city farmer, let's say Texas. I don't know if a Texan farmer ever went to Chelim, but it's just a story, so that's the analogy. His cousin comes, and he gives him the royal tour of the Chelim farm. They finally sit down to dinner, and the Chelim farmer is waiting to say, so cousin, what do you think about my farm here in Chelim? So he says, it's nice and cute, but it's so tiny. So he's like taken aback, he's insulted. He says, so tiny? He says, how big is your farm in Texas? So how is he going to tell him? He says, my farm in Texas? How is he going to give him a point of reference? So he says, it's my farm in Texas, it takes me all day to travel with my tractor from one end of the farm to the next. So the Chelim farmer suddenly smiles to himself and he feels compassion, empathy, rachmanis on his Texan cousin, and he says to him, don't feel bad. I once had a tractor like that too, That's what he said. So the Chelim farmer was not being cute. He was not malicious. But if someone put out a question to you and said, are you closed-minded, narrow-minded, or open-minded? Or are you objective and subjective? I don't think many people would mark the box, I'm narrow-minded and subjective and blind or something. Because part of being subjective is it makes you think you're objective, obviously. So the Chelim farmer was also not maliciously subjective, but he was subjective. He couldn't even dream of a farm that large. Imagine you live your whole life in a place that's daled al daled, just a few cubics large. Can you dream of, imagine thousands of acres? So for him, when he heard that it takes him all day to travel with his tractor from one end to the next, he was sure it was the vehicle. He once also had a shmata, jalopy like that took him all day to crank up to go from here to here. He was sure it was not the farm, it was the vehicle. We all do the same thing. We have our farm. Our farm is whatever we decided or not decided, what we grew up with, what we explored, and we came to a certain, this is our parameters. Someone tells you something that's outside of it, 99.9%, you're going to fit it into your parameters and you'll find some reason to fit it in. If you're an intelligent person, you'll always leave a little opening, maybe not. But it's not common because, and for good reason, we're intelligent people. We can't keep on rethinking our philosophies every day. So we try to fit it into the shelves of our parameters, of our structures. But what happens if you hear something that you never heard before? What happens if it's really something new and revelation? And what you do is you fit it back into your old farm. You're going to miss the boat. You're going to miss a major message that's coming your way. So we think in our terms. Everybody has their terms. For example, using this whole thing with immortality, I used to use this analogy as well. There was this physicist in the 30s. He was asked by people, because if you're familiar with subatomic physics, quantum mechanics as they call it, no one ever saw an atom. We have, this table is made out of elements that are made out of molecules, like the classic H2O. Water is one part hydrogen, 2 parts oxygen. I'm sorry, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Every object, every element in this world is made up of elements. The elements are made up of molecules. Molecules are made up of atoms. Atoms are made up of subatomic particles. And today we know that subatomic particles are made up of even more subatomic. As far as we can see with a microscope is molecules. No one has ever seen an atom. No one will ever see an atom because it's too small. How do we know it's there? Because we know its effects. By accelerating it or heating it, you could see its impact. We would not have computers today or cellular technology if we did not have a way to manipulate atoms. It's called atomic bomb, nuclear energy. That's all on that level. It's similar to DNA and cells. No, DNA is not visible. DNA is not as small as subatomic particles, but it's still not visible. And the images we have are just ways to visualize it. But it's clearly there because there are ways of testing it. So the skeptic asked this physicist, he said, no one's ever seen subatomic particles. You're coming up with all these brilliant conclusions about the laws of physics. No one's ever seen them. How do you even know how it works? So how do you explain to a person who thinks with his eyes and doesn't realize there's more? So he gave him an analogy. He said there was a fisherman who took a net and spread it all over the seas. And he picked up all types of fish. And there's colors and shapes and sizes and species. There are millions of types of fish. There are hundreds of thousands of species of fish. And he documented everything. And then he came to a brilliant conclusion. His conclusion was that there are no fish in the sea that are shorter than ½ inch long. Now, everything seemed to, he measured. He has the net. He has the documentation. What's the problem? So one of his little kids said to him, let me see your net. He looks at the net, and the net has spaces between the strings, between the ropes of ½ inch. So what happened to the fish that were shorter than ½ inch? They fell back into the water. So he should have said only one qualification for getting this Nobel Prize, which is using a net with ½ inch spaces, you're not going to catch any fish that are shorter than ½ inch long. Now obviously you don't need to do all this testing to know that. In other words, his mistake was not his conclusion. His mistake was he didn't define his tools. What tools are you using? Someone's going to say, I don't see electricity. So say, what are you using to? With your eyes? You don't see with your eyes electricity. You see it in other ways. You see its effects. You can feel it. You can get a shock, etc. Love. You don't see love. There's millions of things we don't see. And there are things we don't hear. And there are things we can't taste, touch, and smell either. But we're so consumed and so, you can say, hypnotized, seduced by our 5 senses, our ears, our eyes, our ears, our taste, touch, and smell, that is reality. And people will say, if I don't see it or hear it or taste, touch, and smell, maybe it's there, maybe not. If I see it, it's for sure there. Now, you don't need to be brilliant to understand that statement is very childish and not even true. Because I would argue that the biggest things in life, the most important things in life are not experienced through the 5 senses. God forbid someone loses a family member. You don't see, touch, taste, smell, anything. It's pain. Pain is pain. Pain is deeper there than any pain in the physical world. And the same opposite, love. The love of a child. Yes, you express it. You can hug your child. You can kiss your child. You want to see your child. But it doesn't originate from that. That's already a symptom. That's an expression. The love, the actual love of a parent to a child is impossible to contain in 5 senses. You could describe it to some extent. There are things you can't even describe in words. So the deeper you go in the world of truth, actually, the less ways you can actually experience it. If you really want to put it this way, the real truth of things is completely not tangible. Why do you think God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Lo yireini adam v'chai, that no person can see me and live? Because truth cannot be seen. If you want to see naked, pure truth, you will cease to exist. You can't be you and experience total truth. No way. You have to have some blindness. That's why Ili Yadaitiv Hiyisiv is an expression. If I knew him, I would be him. But we're so seduced, as I said, and so trapped by our farm and our tools. So when you talk about immortality, you're not talking at all about true life. You're talking about immortality. Can this table be forever? Can this body be forever? Can this ego? Can my accomplishments be forever? What Avram Avinu really discovered was really what was promised to Adam and Chava. Don't eat from the tree. Don't puncture your physical being, and you will have something forever. So Avram realized, and the generations of afterwards of Jews realized, that we will have it, but today we can't yet have it physical. Because of Chet Eitzadas. There's no way. Once Adam and Chava some way created a split between the cup and the water, and they punctured the physical world, that immortality cannot manifest forever in a body. But spiritually, absolutely. But it's through actions. It wasn't through philosophies. You know, Abraham's big chiddush, big contribution was not that he was a brilliant philosopher, which he was, and that he was Mesiras Nefesh and committed all the way, but that he built a family that would follow. That's a big achievement. Imagine. He came to a revelation that no one on earth ever came to at this time. Avram Ivri, he was completely separate from everyone. Nobody believed what he believed. He defied everybody. He was the ultimate revolutionary. The ultimate nonconformist. He didn't even have a synagogue to go to. Thank God. There was Shel Shem Ve'ever, whatever that was, some type of yeshiva. We still don't know exactly what kind of yeshiva it was. That yeshiva, I'm sure, was a pretty good one. You know, but it wasn't like, it definitely did not have an endowment, and it didn't have any fundraising going on. So it was very pure type of yeshiva. Where it was, I don't really know. It's very hard to figure it out. We just know there was this thing going on. But he was completely alone. So he could embrace what he embraced, but how do you teach it to your children and make sure that they will continue? There must have been something, because he showed them immortality. He said, here's the way you change the world forever. And we may never know exactly what words he used to Yitzchak. We know what it says in the Torah, but you have to know how to decipher it. But clearly something he imparted to his children that Lahavdil Pare and Aristotle and Julius Caesar and all the greatest people that ever lived could not impart. No matter how much money they had, no matter how much power they had, no matter how much influence they had, they could not impart it. And there's no question what it comes down to was bittul. That's what I was getting to. So the Chelim farmer, and this is all of us farmers, need to have, what's bittul? Bittul means that maybe you don't have it figured out. It's recognizing maybe your net has half-inch spaces or quarter-inch spaces. As soon as you're ready to acknowledge that there's a greater reality than yourself, in a real way, then you are on your way to immortality. What I mean by that is, if you commit to yourself, as great of a person you can be, you can be the man of strength of 20 people, fine. But everything has an end. Everything that has a beginning has an end. Everything mortal will die, including the greatest achievements and the greatest philosophies and the greatest ideas. But what happens if you decide, you know what, I'm not dedicated to myself. I'm dedicated to something beyond myself. I mean, that's called serving something greater than yourself. Then, that bittul cannot disappear. You know why it can't disappear? Because you're no longer defined it by any parameters. To put it in the Yiddish expression, bittul kenish batel ved. You can't annihilate something that is by nature annihilated itself in a good way. If something has no longer allowed itself to be defined by ego and parameters, but is defined by so-called invisibility, that doesn't matter if I get an award or not. The main thing is that the cause must continue. Then how could you ever destroy such a person? You could destroy his body, you can never destroy what he's committed to. Because what he's committed to is not the here and now, it's beyond. You can only destroy something that is defined by the properties of space and time. You cannot destroy something that has chosen not to be defined by space and time. As soon as one says one connects to God, and it's not the God that we think of, because God too is just like with the net and with the farm. Most people's God is just like someone that's 1,000,000 times bigger than my father or my principal. That's for most people. Maybe God has to be defined not on our terms. If you think of God as the essence of life and immortality itself, then if you connect to it, then in a way you become immortal by extension. Because you are now an extension and a channel of something greater than yourself. So the formula is simple. You commit to yourself, you'll only have as much as you have. You commit to something beyond yourself, you will have an extension of that beyond. If that beyond happens to be immortal, you become an extension of immortality. That's what it comes down to. That's why when the Rambam says that the Torah is nitzchis, the Torah is immortal, because God is immortal, it's essentially, once you become, so to speak, a servant or an extension of something that is immortal, you become an extension and a reality of it as well. Now, this may sound good in words, but the fact is, as I said, thousands of years proves proof in the pudding. We don't need to be very wise to understand we're not exactly tzaddikim, and we're not exactly on that level of immortality. But we're here. Explain that. How are we here with all our flaws and weaknesses, and with all the corruption that I mentioned before in the system and the mechanical Judaism? We're here not because of us, to be very honest. We're here because someone did something right, and they planted the seeds, and they were not committed to themselves, they were committed to something greater than themselves. And I will say this, since I've been so anti-Semitic in a way, I want to say something good for the Jews too, that even in the most mechanical Jewish community, there's still, you can find these beautiful gems of eternity. Even individuals. I'm not saying it's perfect, and it's far from perfect. People have not integrated it. But there's a certain, even in the mechanical behavior, when you see a Jew gets up 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and just goes to daven, even if he's completely brainless about it, there's some beauty to it. Obviously, it'd be a lot greater if he also gave it some thought, but then if he did, he'd probably stop doing it. So, but I mean to say, if he integrated it, there's a beauty to it because he's continuing a tradition that was there. So he may not even know the power of it, or maybe he does. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't any of that immortality. There definitely is, and people today will also giving their lives in their own way to try to pass it on. The problem is we have today a modern world. We're not living in a shtetl. There are new challenges, and you can't just rely on pure Kabbalah sale and just mechanically doing it because there's just too much competition, so to speak. So it has to be internalized, or else it will be lost to many, as we see. You know, assimilation, strangely, is a product of modernity, not of the old days when they had all the persecution. Because today we have the comforts. You know, when you have the comforts, it's much more easier today to be mortal than then. Because today, our mortality is so beautiful. You have blackberries and blueberries and brown berries. And I know those names didn't come. They're coming next few decades. You'll have them. Preview. And we have gadgets, and we have pizza shops, kosher pizza shops, and kosher sushi and glatko on every level. So our mortality has become a lot more attractive today. Sadly, it affects immortality. That's now I'm not suggesting we have to give up our comforts, but to bridge the two is the challenge. How do you bridge the two? You know, when you're persecuted, you have no choice but to turn to the immortal. When everyone around you is trying to kill you, the only thing they had was their beliefs. But today, the beliefs can fall very easily aside because there's so much comfort. So, the only final question I didn't answer was about Yaakov Lemes. I'll just say briefly because we're running out of time, even though, I don't know, what's the curfew in New York? 1 o'clock? Yeah, I understand. Briefly, the answer with Yaakov, why Yaakov is different than all the others. Mazare b'chaim, afhu b'chaim. I implied that the answer given is because they say that by Yaakov, in some way, Yaakov also infiltrated also his body. So even though physically we don't see his body, obviously his body is buried in Moras HaMachpelah, like the other patriarchs, but in some way he created a step toward Tchis HaMesim. That's what it says. That's why he was the one that was ready to reveal Mashiach. So his Yaakov Lemes is not just the soul lives on. Everyone's soul lives on. But Yaakov made steps, which we don't see today yet, physically, made steps to actually permeate even the physical universe with some of that immortality. Which is why Yaakov was able to go to Mitzrayim and no one else was able to. He gave the power to the Jews there to be able to live there and 210 years and come out intact, and so on. I'll leave it for another time to discuss it more at length. It's not so much the theme here relevant, but based on what I said earlier, the bittul that we allow ourselves to access this immortality of the soul then returns, as I said, and feeds the body. Because if you allow your body then to become a vehicle of your neshama, of your soul, then if the soul is immortal, your body will ultimately also be immortal. We've not reached that time yet. But think of it the same way. Just like I said before, ego, power. The more you hold on to the material, the less immortality you can ever have, because mortal things die. If you worship what dies, then you're a dying person, put it bluntly. If you worship that which lives on forever because it was never born, something immortal, then you become a part of that immortality. The problem is that our bodies don't yet appreciate that, because our bodies do worship the material. At best, you'll find people who have physical bodies, but they also have ideals that are immortal. The ultimate goal, as the Ramban paskins, not like the Rambam, is that they will join together, where matter and spirit will become one fusion of immortality. Today is not the day yet, but the work we do, and that's why when we do a mitzvah, it's not just that we spiritually live on, that you do something today, lives on forever, the good deed. It changes the physical world too. Now, people don't think about this, but we live in a world today of such freedoms. It didn't happen by accident. Because if you really believe that the sacrifices and the good deeds that people did thousands of years ago really change something, and they mean something, then they have to change the world, and they have. Take one example. The United States of America is the first institutionalized government, established a little more than 270 years ago, based on Torah principles. What is that principle? One basic principle, the key to the whole country. It's right in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, when they state that we, the people, and they declare the following, that all men are created equal, all humans are created equal, and everyone has unalienable rights endowed to them by the Creator. Those are not my words, it's the words from the founding fathers. Non-Jewish leaders who were not Jews, they were Christians, they were Protestants, they were deists, whatever you want to call them. This is the key foundation of democracy, or more important, the Bill of Rights. Now, if you want contrast, before that moment, for thousands of years, except in the world of the Jews, every nation, every monarchy, every government, from east to west, from China to Europe, Africa, was ruled by a monarch, by one leader, by two leaders, by a church, whatever, who had absolute power. There was no such thing as rights. A king could take away the right from anybody. Now you could argue, what about the kings in Israel? We could talk about that. But the bottom line is, remember, the Torah says every human being is created b'tselem Elokim. That's basically almost what they write in the Declaration of Independence without using those words. That the God that gave divine rights to every individual and nobody can take it away from you. The United States of America is the first country that came to that, but it took thousands of years of wars, persecutions. And yes, even Christianity, the Rambam says, as bizarre as it may sound, he says helps pave the path toward Mashiach. That's what he writes. Look at the end of Hilchos Malachim, end of his book. It was taken out in later editions by the Roman censors. But in the original, that's exactly what he writes. Same thing with Islam, by the way. Now, with that being said, so that's just one example. From a Torah, especially from a mystical point of view, the Zohar says that in the year 1840, which corresponds, the Goyish year 1840 corresponds to Hey Alofim Tov Reish, 5600, which means essentially, what is it, 160, 170 years ago. The Zohar says in Pashaneach that there'll be an explosion, a revolution of knowledge. Chachmila and Chachmatata, higher knowledge and lower knowledge. And it says clearly, 1840 is when the Industrial Revolution is considered to began. So it's not an accident that the developments in politics, in human rights, in science, in so many other ways are coming to a fusion of spirit and matter. Because the bottom line is, the thousands of years and sacrifices of people doing what's right in bringing these two worlds together. Remember, by Matan Torah, that was the whole point. Marriage of heaven and earth, al yenim and tachtenim, that the physical world can be a spiritual force, actually refine the world. Individually, people can still make choices that are very cruel, obviously. We see that. But collectively, the world has changed. And there's no doubt about it. I'm being brief here, but if you want me to elaborate, I can elaborate another time. But you see that the world has changed as a result of people's collective result of years of work. So why should we not believe, you don't even need faith, that it will continue? The path will continue. There'll be ups and downs. And individually, again, I said people make their choices, but collectively, That's the direction we're going. And ultimately there'll be a total fusion of spirit and matter. And if you want, that is the logical explanation of what we say Mechayim Mesim in the third prayer of the Shemoneh Esrei. So even resurrection can be explained. It doesn't have to be scientific, but philosophically there's no problem to explain how material and spiritual can come together, especially if you're familiar with physics. So the bottom line is that Yaakov did a part in that no one did before him. That's why he particularly is called Lemes more than the others. Something he passed on that Avram and Yaakov, Yaakov Asher Podas Avram, Yaakov had a power. It's called Tiferes, Shalom, the middle path. Kav Emtzai, Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gvura, Yaakov is Tiferes. Tiferes goes all the way up from Kesed all the way to Malchus. It is the secret to eternal life. The other side, the other paths are not as immortal, let's put it that way. Because he has the ability, like the spine, to go all the way from top to bottom. Midas emes. They say Yaakov is emes. What do you think truth is? So it says in Yerushalmi, the word truth, emes, is 3 letters. The first Hebrew letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, the last, Tov, and Mem, the 11th letter. Because truth is true from the beginning, Ani Rishon, Ani Achren, beginning through the end and through the middle. If something is only true in one section, rest assured, even there it's not true. Like I said with the Mayim Chaim. If it doesn't live later, if it dies at some point, even in the beginning it's already dying. Sheker, on the other hand, is 3 letters, and they're all right near each other. Kuf, Resh, Shin. Almost the next to the last 3 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Because Sheker, Ein Le Raglayim. Sheker doesn't have any feet to stand on. So every lie needs another lie to support it. Check it out. Next time you lie, tell me how many other lies you're going to have to do to cover up the first lie. So it can't stand on its own. So it's not confident to be spread out everywhere. It hangs around in its own corner. Kuf, Resh, Shin, and so on. So, immortality. We have the ability to reach immortality, but it comes down to, as soon as you stop searching and stop seeking it, by giving up something, by surrendering to something greater, that's when it begins to enter. Like all truths in life. Love, as I said, and everything else. It's the bittul, the ability to accept and yield to something greater than yourself. That's when it comes back to you and gives you much more than you'll ever give. But that paradox is something that very few can really master. Because the tendency, the inclination is you want to hold on to it. You don't want to let go. But the greatest people are people who know how to let go. When they let go, that's when they get that in return. So, I want to wish everybody an immortal night. A taste. Every time you make that move and you do a deed like that, it's a little taste of immortality. And in that spirit, that's right. I want to dedicate this class to another great soul who unfortunately was taken far too early. A good friend, Danny Namdar. He's a good friend of mine. In his yahrzeit is this week. No. Who gave you this? This is a class from April 28th to 2010. Is there another one? Since I'll mention him anyway because his family has been supporting what we've done. That's what it says here. This is your father. I know his yahrzeit is after Pesach. Right. But they gave it to me. That's so funny. Does he have a birthday coming up?
It was just now, actually.
Oh, okay, maybe that's what I don't know why they wrote this. I'm looking to see the date, and then I realized. But anyway, since I'm mentioning him, this is his daughter. I was very close with him, and he's been a help financially, his family, to what we do. But also in the spirit, his spirit lives on, as I said. And here's a child of his, so I guess that was why it was mentioned. So be it. So he lives on through you. And Mazar B'chaim, as I said. And we should only hear good news, and you all will have a choice every moment, almost every moment of the day, the choice whether you're going to choose yourself or you're going to choose something bigger than yourself. So I won't tell you which one to choose. You can figure it out on your own. So I want to mention again, tomorrow night Philip will be giving his class 7 p.m. Anyone, if you haven't left your email address, please do so we can stay in the loop, make any announcements we do by email. I announce what the classes will be about or any changes. And I shall be here next Wednesday again. And it's always a great honor to sit with kindred spirits, immortal souls, as we continue the marathon of history. And hopefully we will live to see the whole fusion of it in our lifetimes. Everyone have a great night. Thank you.